myself. My name is Alana, and I am I'm a research advisor in the Migration and Displacement initiative within Save the Children International team. And I'm here with Linda today. We Linda was a key lead researcher and consultant on this study, so together we're going to give you a bit of a kind of key headlines and findings to this study that we did around digital safeguarding, and hopefully there'll be opportunities to have some discussions and answer any questions along the way. So I'll just start off by giving you a brief introduction before I hand over to Linda to take you through some of the more meaty findings from this. So I think firstly, I just wanted to say that this study builds on an existing study that we have done on emerging digital technology, which looked at programs with migrant and displaced children and identified some gaps in terms of potential harm mitigation and recommendations. So building on this study, this particular digital safeguarding study was commissioned to really help identify some of those risks in more detail and ways in which we could mitigate against them, particularly from the arising of adoption and use of new technology. So that's really where the study came about. So I also just wanted to give you a bit of a background to the context of where the study sits. So in terms of the situation of this study, we understand that there's digital technology can provide the capacity for positive and transformative change, and we understand that there are real benefits to the use of digital technology. And of course, when it comes to migration and displacement sphere and displaced people, we understand that technology is really being used to help inform themselves, to access information and communicate. And this has been particularly exacerbated by COVID-19 and this kind of demand and need for the shifting online and for more remote programming, for example, within case management and family reunification. And aid organisations, therefore, are very much relying on data and technology to reach and assist children on the move and really ensure that they are able to reach the most vulnerable groups. There is potential problems that arise from this, obviously, in the sense that the use of new technology poses some ethical dilemmas that can potentially threaten the safety and well-being of children. I think agencies and the sector, we're not always in the best position to keep pace with this change of technology, and we don't always understand all of the risks that can bring. So I think it's important to know some of these problems that this can create. And so we sort of identify this real need for us as a sector to be better equipped to deal with safeguarding when it comes to digital programming, understanding that actually for most organisations, we're still kind of operating within traditional safeguarding policies and practices. So we identify this need for aid actors to be better equipped with the digital safeguarding mechanisms to really help prevent harm to children and also to reduce the legal and reputational risks of our organisations themselves as well. Before we get into the detail of what the study was about, I thought it would be worth just giving you a very brief snapshot of what we see to be what do we see to be digital technology and how we're defining it. And I think really this is just to show you that it's a very long list of things which digital technology can involve. And it could be something from as kind of a piece of hardware such as a mobile device, but it could also be anything from sort of using big digital data, GPS systems, kind of the use of biometrics and face tracking, and a multitude of other kind of tools and platforms or any sort of application that rely on data. So we really went for this kind of quite broad definition of digital technology when we were conducting the study. And in terms of what this study was about, so we kind of had a two-phased approach. There was a comprehensive literature review that was done at the very beginning. And then also this involved kind of bringing in literature from the academic space, also from our own organisation and others within the sector to identify reports and documents. And then this was also supplemented with primary data, with interviews with employees within Save the Children across the globe. As you can see from this map, we tried to get a very big spread of those who would take part both within Save the Children and also trying to make sure we spoke to experts within the field as well, within the aid sector particularly focused on technology and innovation. And this was conducted in December to December 2019 to April 2020. So it was both coupled around the COVID-19 crisis as well, when that was just starting up. So that's possibly useful kind of context when you look through some of the findings. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a useful context and kind of situate the research. I'm going to hand over to Linda now to talk a bit more about the digital risks for children on the move.
Alana, and thanks everybody for coming in today. As Alana said, I worked on the research for this study, and it was quite interesting to just, even, as Alana said, moving from a pre-COVID to a post-COVID context during the research was really interesting to see how the needs and the issues, kind of were amplified once people were trying to do their own research and their own work during the COVID pandemic when it first started off. We found, or we created a typology of risk based on the work that we did. And I'll talk you a little bit through the 4 areas of risk that we thought it would be useful for agencies and organizations to think about when they're embarking on their programming using different types of digital tools. The first one is really around exclusion, potential for children to be left behind. The second one is potential for harm if we're using technology that hasn't really been tested or tried before. The third one is around exposure to online abuse that we might be encouraging or enabling if we're, trying to get children to go online or to use different types of social media. And then the last one is around data misuse or mishandling. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit more detail on each one of these kinds of risks. The first one around children being left behind. This is one I think that most organizations are quite aware of in terms of using digital tools, is really, we know that so many children are unable to access these tools. They can't access the internet. They don't have devices that are available to them. And so that's one area of exclusion that that we thought about. Sorry, I have my cat is here wanting to participate in our webinar today, so apologies if I'm trying to keep her off the screen. So the first piece is really whether children have the technology or the internet connection to take part. We really saw this during COVID because I think most specifically in terms of education, when so much education went online and we saw so many children were unable to, stay enrolled in school. And I think we're seeing now some really, scary statistics about the number of children who probably won't ever return to school after that sort of break and the remote introduction of school. So that's one piece to really think about in terms of harms and risks is really, how are we enabling exclusion of children when we use online services or when we introduce online services. The second area that we dug into here was that as we're starting to move into using predictive analytics or using big data in order to better understand the populations that we're working with, is that data complete? Does that data include children that we want to work with? If we know that so many children are offline, they're not using social media, they're not providing, sort of big data, then are we completely missing them when we're trying to, use data to predict or to orient or target populations for different kinds of programming? How high quality is data that we're using when we're using some of the big data types of tools and technologies? And so there's a big question there. And then the third piece that we saw here was, really children and their parents might opt out of, providing us with data if they don't trust our agencies and our organizations. So we saw, for example, cases when we spoke with staff of children who were in transit, who were migrating from one country to another, not trusting the agencies that were asking them for their details. And these were child protection agencies that wanted to support children, but children were so nervous about providing their data, thinking it might be going to government or it might be used against them, that they would not provide their information or they would provide fake information. And so that then means, again, that we're not sure how high quality the data is that we're collecting when we're using our digital tools and devices. And so that can also lead to a form of exclusion, but we really talked about that as being kind of self-exclusion, where someone kind of purposefully excludes themselves because they're not sure how their data might be used. And this can again lead to people who really need services not being too afraid to get those services. We see this also in the United States, for example, where a lot of undocumented populations are worried about providing their data because they might be deported if that data gets into the hands of government. The second, sorry, could you go back one slide, Alana, to number 2? Yeah. So the second big risk that we looked at was around humanitarian innovation. And here we've seen a big, a lot more organizations are testing and trialing different types of technologies. And in some cases, this is done in countries where there's very little regulation or where there's weak governance. And so there have been cases of companies that are looking for places to kind of try out applications or try out data models in countries where there is weak regulation, so that they don't have to pass through regulatory processes in order to get there, in order to collect particular kinds of data. So we're seeing this with health applications and education applications that have very little regulation. And so this can be an issue, an ethical issue, if we're thinking about testing and trialing things on populations that are quite vulnerable if these things haven't, they're not being regulated in any way. And so where this comes in with aid agencies and with humanitarian organizations and those working with migrants and refugees is that we might be entering into contracts or partnerships with some companies who are testing and trialing things without really understanding the potential for unintended consequences, or with a low understanding of how the data that they're collecting from the populations that we have access to could be used for different reasons, and potentially shared, shared beyond what people are expecting, or used for developing certain products and services without ethical review. Sometimes when agencies need funding, they get very excited about working with corporations or going to in-kind agreements without understanding exactly what they're providing in return, and without full consent from populations in terms of their data. So this can be active harm if there's some type of harm that results from an innovation that's being used or introduced to a very vulnerable population. But it can also be a passive risk if you think about the time and the energy that an agency is spending on supporting a corporation to improve its technology tools. If they're not going to be successful, that's time or energy that could be spent on other things. And so we need to just be careful that agencies aren't being sucked into some of these newer innovations without a clear understanding of what the potential benefits might be and the potential risks. The third area, which I'll go into a little bit more, as I mentioned, is that we can be introducing children to greater risk of online harm. So if we're using social media, if we're using Facebook, or we're using other types of large platforms, and encouraging children and young people to go on these platforms, we could be, of course, we're doing it with all of the best intentions, and maybe these are the only tools that we have access to. They're the tools that reach the widest number of young people, but we could then also be introducing children to harm from, online predators, from harmful content like pornography or extremism. And if children are on the move, they might not be with a parent or guardian, or their parent or guardian might be very distracted by other things. And so this can leave children open. If children are already vulnerable, if they are economically vulnerable, if their self-esteem is low, some of these situations can lead to children being more vulnerable online to adults or others who are trying to take advantage of them or exploit them. So these are also risks that we need to think about when we are encouraging children to use social media platforms. How are we helping children protect themselves when they're online, and how are we providing some oversight so that we're not accidentally introducing them to risks that could be quite difficult. And then the fourth risk that I'll go into a little bit more is the the potential for data misuse or mishandling. And so in some cases, we've found across the humanitarian and the social sector and the NGO sector that agencies might have less understanding of the value of data or the ways that data can be used in the current market. So data can be misused in really harmful ways. There have been reports of immigration authorities being able to access data, whether that's on social media platforms or whether it's data that is shared by agencies that are supporting refugees and asylum seekers. Sometimes that data has been shared with government authorities who then use that to find people or to deport them or to detain them. And so we just need to be really careful about the kinds of data that we're collecting and sharing and the potential that it could be misused or mishandled in ways that can harm people. We also need to be careful about data breaches, for example. If we're not keeping data secure, then we could be putting people at the risk of having their data breached, identity theft, losing access to their benefits, their financial, their accounts, their bank accounts, or their other personal identity aspects. And then another aspect here is thinking about if the data that we're collecting on people is somehow stigmatizing them, and if that stigmatization is carried, if they carry that stigmatization in their data going towards the future. So an example of that would be, there have been some reports that refugees who were accessing cash transfers through cash transfer programs, because that was in their file, they were being denied small loans at official banks in the future, because now they had this kind of label of having been a refugee, which then made them less desirable as credit seekers in the eyes of some financial institutions. So those are a lot of things to think about. We definitely go into them more in the report, but just thinking about that typology of risks can be helpful for organizations if you're thinking about doing a risk assessment or thinking about designing or developing your programs. These are 4 areas that you might want to think about in terms of reducing and mitigating risks before you get started. So we were curious if these 4 areas of risk align with your work or things that you're seeing in your work. And yeah, if you want, you can raise your hand or you can type something in the chat if you'd like to contribute here. I think Alana and I are quite interested in knowing, how relevant these risk areas are for folks working in this area. So I'll just pause in case anybody wants to say anything.
Yes, thank you, Linda. As I said in the beginning, if you want to speak, feel free to write something in the chat and I will give you possibility to speak. Or if you're a bit shy to speak in this way, there is of course a chat where you can share your experience and your professional ideas and tools, your work. I was listening to you while you were speaking and it seems really interesting, and thank you very much for sharing all of these really interesting results you've had and experiences in collecting this data, and I'm always thinking about the high level of responsibility we all have to have when working with children, especially migrant children, and when we learn them how to use when we learn them how to use the social networks, it's very important to teach them about the safety, of course. Yes.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and continue. Yeah. I don't see any questions.
If there is something, I will monitor the chat, okay?
Yeah, but feel free to pop in anytime if anyone has questions or wants to share their own experiences. So the next phase was really, so what do we need to do? We've recognized that there are these issues. So what are some recommendations? So we have 7 key recommendations for the wider sector. The first is around digital inclusion. So we talked about the risk of exclusion. So we want to make sure that when we're designing our programs that we're ensuring that, that we're doing our research ahead of time, that we understand what are the tools and devices, platforms that children and young people have access to, so that if we're incorporating those into our programs, we're sure we're not excluding anyone. And we want to make sure, if we are going to be introducing these different types of tools, that we're that we're building trust. So that's number 2, is establishing trust. This is a long-term and kind of sector-wide issue. And so it's not really up to one agency, it's really up to all of us to ensure that we're protecting data, we're keeping data safe, and that we're overall building greater trust in the sector so that people will be willing to work with us and provide any data. Okay, I see there's a comment in. I'll elaborate more on innovation partnerships, sure. So then the third one is around innovation frameworks. So the comment in the chat comes in at a good time because I was just going to talk about innovation frameworks. So we need to, if we're talking about using new digital tools and technologies, for example, there are humanitarian organizations now that are, piloting things like biometric identification with populations who are quite vulnerable. And there have been some concerns that that sometimes innovation partnerships are, although they're looking to provide specific benefits to the population, they can also have sort of hidden motivations behind some of the technology partners. So we need to be clear that if we are introducing a new technology tool or an innovation into a group that's quite vulnerable or to a setting that's quite vulnerable, we need to make sure that we understand what the motivations are of everyone involved, and ensure that the vulnerable populations are not being kind of used to test and pilot things without their full consent or without a clear understanding of what some of the risks could be. So if you think about back in the day or currently, when we're trialing vaccines or we're trialing different types of health solutions or medicines, we have learned over time that we don't, just kind of go out and find poor people, vulnerable people, and test and trial things on them because they can have severe consequences. And so in that same way of thinking around how we trial and test technology on vulnerable populations, we want to use some of those same types of ethical principles that you see in the field of medicine and pharmaceuticals, so that we're not putting, we're not just finding poor and vulnerable people to test things on where there's little regulation. I don't know if that's sort of what you're asking about, Ilyam, but please feel free to, elaborate further if you have additional questions. So when we're thinking about, introducing different types of innovations with corporate partners or with startup companies, we just want to make sure that that we're using an ethical framework to kind of review those partnerships and make sure that that it's clear what's going on in those partnerships, what are the motivations, make sure there aren't hidden motivations behind wanting to roll out some of these innovations. And so we want to make sure that the risks are not greater than the benefits and that we're really assessing any potential harms before we start implementation. And here it's, again, really important to engage and involve the populations that we're working with in, talking about what some of the potential risks are and understanding their perspectives of whether they're willing to take those risks. So that's kind of around innovation partnership frameworks. The fourth one is making sure that our programs are reflecting the needs and concerns of the population. So again, here sometimes we get very excited as agencies about working with new technologies and being innovative. And we might be moving in a direction that's not actually meeting some of the needs and concerns that the populations that we're working with have. So again, we want to make sure we're not pushing innovations and pushing the use of digital tools for our own benefit without making sure that it's definitely of the benefit for populations that we're working with. Sometimes our organizations have a real drive for efficiency, scale, cost savings. So we might be excited about technologies that can reduce our costs and enable us to scale further. But that could reduce the, lower the positivity of the experiences of the people that we're working with. So we just want to make sure that we're, again, balancing that we're not only using technology for our own benefit. 5 is around digital literacy and capacity across the sector. And again, this is a really important piece because most of of the large international organizations are building their own digital literacy and their own capacities, but we always work with partners in this space. And so making sure that that we're also working together with partners, that we're supporting capacity development across local partners, across grassroots organizations. Because if we have a great digital, safeguarding data protection system in place at an international organization, but there isn't enough funding or support for a partner organization at the grassroots to also protect data, then it's really not ideal. So we need to think about digital literacy and digital capacity for people in different roles, different parts of organizations, and different parts of the wider, kind of the delivery chain of products and of services and benefits to vulnerable populations. 6 is around ownership, governance, and training. So here we need to make sure that all of our organizations have policies in place that assign responsibility and accountability for digital risk and harms. And making sure, again, that we have policies in place that lay out who needs to be trained, which capacities need to be built, what kinds of training do we need to make sure that across all of our partners, everyone has the same kind of understanding, and it's very clear who holds responsibility and accountability if something does go wrong with data or with the use of technology. And then 7 is making sure that our systems are upgraded to ensure that we're not putting people at risk. So as I mentioned, a lot of times across the sector, the humanitarian and the development sectors, we never have enough money to invest in our digital systems because we're working project by project, and there's not often kind of core institutional funding that can help us to improve our IT systems and the way that we're protecting data in those systems. So this is another area that we need to really think about across the whole sector is, how can we upgrade our systems to more secure systems so that we are not vulnerable to data breaches and leaks of data that can put people at risk. So those are the recommendations that we have. And again, I have questions for you if you have thoughts from your perspective. Are there any recommendations missing from our list? Anything that you would suggest that we include? Any questions or challenges that you're having in any of these areas?
I also just want to add, Linda, that I think this is, whilst we've obviously focused on this at looking at migrant and displaced children, so very, very vulnerable groups, I think a lot of the recommendations that have come from this have a wider application as well. So it may be, if you're working outside of that sector too, with those types of individuals, that actually there's other things that this could be applicable for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we don't have any questions right now in the chat, but as always, you can feel free to drop something in as we go along. And I'll hand back over to you, Ilana.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I just wanted to kind of wrap up by just talking a bit about what we're doing at Save the Children with some of these findings, because we know this is not the end. This is very much the very beginning of us making sure that we are embedding our safeguarding practices within programming, and so that is one of the main things that's happening now, is that there is a push to include more digital practices within an overarching digital programming strategy. But we're also making sure that the current practices are being updated and edited, frameworks are being updated and developed, and resources and tools which aren't just focused on safeguarding in the traditional sense, but are considering safeguarding in the wider digital programming space. And as I say, not necessarily just for within the migration and displacement context, but kind of more broadly as well. And along with that, we are aiming to create more kind of briefing documents for those who are actually implementing projects and programs, so that they're considering some of those risks and understanding what they need to do to make sure that they have considered the safeguarding needs from a digital lens. So that includes things like risk assessment processes and audit processes, and as well as kind of building on the finding that Linda mentioned in relation to kind of digital literacy, trying to build our kind of e-learning courses to make sure that there is content that specifically addresses some of these points around the digital safeguarding component, and essentially making sure that we have a good kind of summary and overview about what it is that our approach is to digital safeguarding in the longer term. As I said, that will kind of come under our umbrella called digital programming strategy. And that's just kind of the beginning. I think there's definitely elements where we want to make sure that we are identifying what we need to be prioritizing next, in terms of kind of guidance and training and other types of capacity building. So there's lots, I think, that we will be doing in the future. These are just a kind of a few examples of things that we think we can kind of start focusing on in the shorter term. And yeah, I think that's it from us. Also just to flag, and I'm sure we can share with you after this, the full report is available on our resource center, and I can share a link via Vesna, and we can make sure you have access to that if you'd like to kind of look at it in a bit more detail at a later stage. But I'll pause now if there's any questions or points that you'd like to clarify or anything else that you would like to ask. Thanks.
Thank you, Lana, for yes, you can send me the file and I will upload to the Child Hub webinar page, and also with the recording of this webinar today. So you will be able to find the recording and the file Tilana Ilinda shared. And also this is a final possibility, I would say, if you have, yes, great, for a link there is in the chat. So I would say that this is the final possibility to ask a question in the webinar. If you have any kind of impression, any kind of your experience sharing, you can of course do it now through chat, and also it can be done. I will give you the floor and the possibility to open a microphone. I will also take opportunity also to thank again to Linda and Lana for being with us today, and for sharing such a really useful material, and I think it can be really inspiring for all of other organizations that are working in the area of digital safety. I think it's great that we could see that after this data and after these recommendations, we could see the next steps that you are planning to do, which is really great because it has a base in the research and in the real needs of the children. So it's I felt it can be really inspiring. So okay, so I think that it is all for now. Thank you very much also for being with us today. If you, Linda or Ilana, have any kind of final comment, you can of course share it now.
Just to say thanks very much for having us. It's been great to be able to present some of these findings.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And of course, two final notes, like always in the Child Hub. If you want to receive a certificate of attending our webinar for today, you can send email, just a second, this email address that I wrote in the chat, and you will receive your certificate in a few days. And also a final thing is our evaluation poll. So please give us also a few seconds to click. How satisfied were you with today's webinar? Like always, please stay in touch with the Child Hub. I'm not sure, have you seen our new colors, our new logo? And if you have not, please visit us, and also stay with our newsletter and be in touch with all exciting news and the webinars that are coming in the future. So we are not still finished, even the summaries. We could feel that the summer is coming, but we will have also few activities in the beginning of July. So it would be great if you could stick with us. Linda, Ilana, thank you very much again, and have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.